All right, here we go. Today is Sunday, July 9th, 2017, and this is episode 196 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry. How are you, sir?
I'm super duper. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. We've made it yet another week.
I know. Well, we did skip out on the 4th of July, I guess.
You know, that's true, but it was the 4th of July.
Yeah, I was lighting stuff on fire. I couldn't be bothered to podcast.
Ungrateful Colonist Day, as I like to call it. So you survived with all your toes and fingers?
I did. Had a good time. How about you?
Yep. I had a good time. I planned to do some flying, but weather smacked that plan out of existence. Thunderstorms and small planes don't mix so well.
Yeah, well, it's probably best that you sat it out. So
I'm here.
Good. So, just a couple of things before we get started. First up is we're rapidly approaching Security Summer Camp in Las Vegas, and I just wanted to give a quick shout out to TierraCon. And apparently, they're still looking for volunteers. So, if you're so inclined and you're going to be in the area, look them up. They do need some volunteers.
So, what is TierraCon?
TierraCon is a conference that is focused on helping women grow their careers in information security.
And it's happening at the same time as Black Hat and DEF CON?
Yep, that's right.
Besides Las Vegas and whatever else is going on?
Beautiful, scorching Las Vegas, Nevada.
I used to go to DEF CON many years in a row. I kind of fell out of favor, but yeah, it's hot. It's hot this time of year. Especially for wearing all black like I did back then, because I tried to be cool. I failed, but I tried.
Well, you got to try. So I also wanted to say thank you. Usually we do this at the end, but I wanted to put it up front. Thank you to all of our Patreon donors.
Absolutely. You guys are awesome.
So just before we get into the main topic for this evening, I wanted to remind everybody that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers.
But for a sizable fee, it could.
This could be you. That's right. So, there was a kind of a big thing that happened since the last show we had, which was Petya, then not Petya, Niet Petya, kind of Petya, sort of Petya. Has more names than you can shake a stick at.
I don't think I've seen this level of confusion around incidents in a long time.
Oh, clearly. And partly, by the way, I think it's because of its proximity to WannaCry.
I would agree, but I'd also agree that we've kind of gotten into the 24-hour news cycle in the world of InfoSec Twitter.
Yeah,
and
good point.
People want to be first with the news and jump out there and spread, with all good intentions, warn people, spread it. But as I'm sure we'll talk about, the fog of war in this one was thick.
Oh, yeah.
And confusing. And a lot of misinformation got out there that caused much more challenges around solving this problem that I think probably needed to be. But that's maybe a secondary story, but it was definitely a lot of confusion going on with this one.
Yeah, that's for sure. So I presume most people who listen to the show are well aware, but there's a lot of details to this story that may not be obvious, and I'll say kind of a lot of different angles to talk about. So I'm going to give some background here. There's a company named Intellect Service in the Ukraine, and in the Ukraine, apparently companies are mandated to use a government-specified tax program.
One of two.
So, and this Intellect Service produces one of the two government-approved tax applications. But apparently Intellect software has about 80% of the market share of about 400,000 customers. So it's, not a small deal. The name of their tax application is called MEDoc. I don't know what ME stands for, but there you are. And I want to kind of go through this in chronological order because there's really honestly no good way to come at this. The information that Andy and I are going to cover today come from a whole host of different stories, but rather than kind of going through each one individually, I thought it kind of made sense to kind of go through it top to bottom. So where to start? Apparently,
go ahead. I think it's safe to say we don't know when this started truly, because this clearly was a well thought out, well planned, long-term effort.
Yes.
Based on how they got into the systems.
Correct.
So we know first piece of evidence, but clearly things happened before then.
Yeah, and so the allegations just kind of putting the end up front, right? The allegations now at this point are that the perpetrator was Russia.
Maybe.
Well, I mean this is the the formal Ukraine position and also the position of many security companies. So
have we checked with Kevin Mandia?
We've not. And
can we get him on the phone?
I don't know. I don't know if Mr. Trump asked Mr. Putin in their meeting.
Don't we have people? Somebody get him on the phone.
We should get our people on this. So anyhow, this tax application MEDoc apparently has an auto update functionality, and which makes good sense. And that auto update functionality relies on some infrastructure that operates from Intellect Services office. And in the ensuing investigation, it was discovered that apparently Intellect stopped patching the servers involved in roughly 2013.
So to be clear, it's not that they stopped patching the software in question. They stopped doing care and feeding on the servers
correct.
That answered these auto update requests.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. And there's really no there's really no discussion about why that is. So it just at this point it just is. So the actor which is thought to again to be this Telebot group, which is allegedly Russia, apparently compromised the Intellect Service infrastructure using credential theft. So basic, I suppose, phishing, or maybe password reuse. Hard to really say for sure. Anyhow, they ended up with access to Intellect's update infrastructure, and on 3 separate occasions over the course of 2 months, they pushed out a backdoor update. They included in a MEDoc update. This Telebot group. I'm going to make the assumption that it's Telebot. You can think that I'm saying allegedly, right? But this Telebot packaged up a malicious DLL that had a backdoor on 3 separate occasions over the course of 2 months. That backdoor effectively gave Telebot the ability to run arbitrary commands and perform queries through the update infrastructure. So it wasn't that Telebot was directly communicating with the installs of MEDoc at MEDoc's or at the companies running MEDoc. It was that Telebot was controlling the update infrastructure, which was in turn communicating with all of these customers, for allegedly 400,000 customers.
Now let me clarify something that I think, from my reading and understanding, we don't know yet how this backdoor, or you could even call it a bot callback feature, was added. We don't know how that happened and when and how. The reuse credentials that we know about is when they were doing forensic investigation, they looked at the update server, the web app that's running this update server, and that's when they saw that the admin credentials were used to log into that update server and redirect certain communications to the attacker's compromised host.
Yep, that's right.
Is how I read it. So just to clarify, we don't know how the backdoor got added. One of three. Or I should say we don't know when or how. What we do know from the first piece of evidence is that credentials were reused to log into the web app that was running this update service, and in essence, take update requests and redirect them to a third-party host.
Yeah, and so on the fateful day of June 27th, which is when all this fun stuff happened, they saw the Talabot group log into that server and reconfigure the Nginx web server to proxy its traffic over to a server at OVH. Now
what's OVH?
OVH is basically a server hosting, like a cloud hosting provider.
And as far as we know, this OVH host that these commands were proxied over to was also a compromised host that, spoiler warning, ultimately was burned down at the conclusion of this.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So I think this is where where we don't fully understand what happened, but apparently through that proxy traffic was where the NotPetya malware was pushed, right? So it wasn't directly pushed from the the Intellect software server. It was actually pushed as part of this proxy. I mean, this is our current understanding, certainly subject to change. But
so this very subtle backdoor was added to check in for updates and report some information.
Right.
And then the bad guys got into the web host that was doing the updates, redirected certain updates to their compromised host, the command and control server, basically. And that's where the payload of NotPetya
was added.
Added to these MEDoc installations.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So now at this point, we have a whole herd of companies, largely based in the Ukraine, receiving this NotPetya.
Because this was phoning home every
malware.
2 minutes, right? This was very aggressive.
Correct.
It wasn't waiting on the companies to go trigger an update or patch themselves. It was aggressively phoning home.
That's right.
Okay. But it looked like it was connections just back to a known good host.
Yeah, and so that's one of the really difficult things about this particular attack is that from the perspective of the victims, the end victims, the users of MEDoc, all they saw was traffic to the same server, back and forth to the same server. They always see traffic to and from, right? Unless they were actually doing some kind of inspection, and it's not even clear to me if it was being tunneled over HTTPS, and so it may not have been, there may not have been able to, or anything that you could have seen, but, this is a kind of a worst case scenario, right? Because, we often say you ought to really have a good insight into what your systems are communicating with and block things they have no business talking to. But in this case, it all checked out.
Right. I think the only chance, and this is such a small percentile chance, is if you had something doing behavior analysis on your network and saw a check-in that was maybe happening once a day suddenly ramp up to twice a minute. But again, you're going to trace it back to known good software that has an auto-update functionality. You're probably going to assume that was just new functionality pushed by the company.
Exactly right.
Even if you've got all the telemetry and, you can dig into what is actually causing those network calls, I don't think you're going to be necessarily suspicious of that.
Right, because it's MEDoc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's aggressive, and, somebody might complain about the aggressiveness of it, but I doubt it.
Right. But, in hindsight, it really wasn't calling that aggressively for that long before the payload was delivered.
Right.
Right. So, it's not even clear if you would have had time to react to that, to be candid.
So do we know that these callbacks stopped once the payload was delivered, or do they continue every 2 minutes? Or I don't think we know.
Yeah, we don't know that
Okay.
for sure. So what happened from here? Now you have this system that's running MEDOC, which, by the way, it is not clear to me if the normal deployment scenario for MEDOC is on a workstation or on a server. I don't know that, and none of the articles I've read have indicated one way or the other. But regardless, the application, I should say, once the NotPetya worm was pushed down, it, because this was running in the context of an auto update, it almost certainly was being run with local administrator rights on that particular system, whether it was a server or a workstation, because presumably it would need to write to program files or what have you. So the NotPetya malware included basically Mimikatz. And there was a funny Twitter exchange or Twitter rant by the person who wrote Mimikatz, kind of really offended that the author of NotPetya didn't abide by the license terms of Mimikatz.
Well, maybe they can bring in action.
Yeah, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
Like how Al Capone was brought down, right?
Like taxes, in this case, Mimikatz license violation.
Right. So anyhow, used Mimikatz to interrogate the memory on the local system, looking for legitimate credentials it could in turn use on other systems on the network. And if it found those credentials, it tried apparently both PSExec and WMIC to push and execute the malware to systems on the local network. And it had a couple of tricks it used to try to figure out what other systems were on the local network. And also it had the Eternal Blue WannaCry spreader, right? So if you had systems on the network that were vulnerable to that, it wouldn't need legitimate credentials. It could just use the Eternal Blue propagation mechanism. But in order without... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Eternal Blue and Eternal Romance is supposedly the NSA tools.
Correct.
That were leaked.
That was Eternal Blue was what WannaCry used.
Right, and that goes after the vulnerable SMB shares.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. So a lot of confusion in the early hours of this outbreak was how could this possibly be happening? Our environment was patched against Eternal Blue for a long time, and yet here we are. And so throughout the day, it started to become pretty clear that fully patched systems and fully patched environments were in fact being infected, and that was when people started to realize that it was actually stealing credentials out of memory. And I will say, by the way, that this technique is not really novel. It's actually something that's used in many of the more advanced attacks that are typically perpetrated by an actual hands-on keyboard type actor, right? But this was basically automating that chain. And so this is not a new thing.
So they grab creds out of memory of the initial compromised host.
Right.
Then what? How are they spreading from there?
Right. So it relied on the credentials in memory having permissions, basically administrator permissions on other systems on the network. So if that wasn't the case, like if you only had local admin on the computer MEDOC was running on, it wasn't going to propagate off of that unless one of the other systems was again vulnerable to Eternal Blue. But barring those two facts, it really wouldn't have moved off of that.
Or local admin uses the same username and password in every host.
Right.
Yeah, which is common.
Never happens.
So it would use PSExec and that sort of stuff to move it around to other hosts locally.
Right. It had PSExec, had a copy of PSExec bundled inside it. And so, I even saw a lot of discussions, even up to the second day, about advice being bantied about saying, make sure your system doesn't have PSExec on it, and
Which doesn't help you because it's bundled with the code.
because it's bundled in the malware. Yeah.
Now,
So
also about this time, I remember a lot of people saying that the initial infection vector was phishing.
yes, that's a great point. So again, in the fog of war here, right? All at the time, really, all people knew was something really terrible was going on. Systems were being wiped, and we haven't even talked about what ultimately happens. But anyway, we'll get to
Right.
that in a second. So this thing is just crawling through networks at a mass scale, and there's a lot of debate going on, especially on Twitter and in other venues that I was privy to, about this was being spread by phishing, right? That was being seeded to organizations around the world with phishing emails, I certainly haven't had time to do any kind of an exhaustive, retrospective analysis of all of the people who said that, but I've got to believe if you run a network of any size with any number of large number of endpoints, you're probably having things happen all the time in terms of infections or triggers, some kind of an antivirus trigger on a workstation or whatever. And so I think, don't know for sure, but I think what probably happened was, organizations started seeing systems being crypto locker. I'm using the generic term, right? Their systems being locked up, and so they started going back and see, well, what happened around that time? Oh, well, Jerry opened up an email.
So, and I wonder if that, Cisco has a bunch of research on this. They were one of the groups that responded on the ground and whatnot. And their view of this is that, quoting from one of their research papers, like WannaCry, there were reports of an email vector. This is most likely because some of the earliest infected machines had concurrent Loki-bot infestations with indicators of an email vector for that malware. And after careful research, Talos concluded that for the delivery of the, they call it Netya malware, all installations came through the MEDOC update system.
Correct.
So that's their view of things.
Microsoft released a TechNet article which basically said the same thing. They looked at telemetry they collected through, I think it was ATP and Windows Defender and other, everybody cries about all the data they collect, but, apparently maybe that comes in handy every now and then. So anyway, Microsoft says...
Yeah, if you're the NSA.
That's true. Microsoft claims that, at least that, I think this article was from the day after, or 2 days after, that all of the infections they saw originated from MEDOC as well.
So, just focusing on just for a moment, we kind of alluded to this at the beginning of the show. This fog of war was really confusing, I think, for a lot of defenders, especially when this was getting press. Those of us in the trenches are trying to figure out how to defend our organizations before we get hit. We're getting different pieces of information. Of course, the marketing teams from various companies start jumping on this, after about 12 hours. They don't help. So this was an interesting one of those with the best of intentions spreading potentially false information. I mean, I'd heard reports of companies shutting down email servers trying to stop this spreading in. And that is an interesting thing I think we're going to have to watch for. And this goes to, in my mind, this speaks to a larger issue with threat intelligence of how do you know, how do you get it fast enough, and how do you know if it's accurate, and how do you choose to respond to it? And in a situation of where we're seeing these worms start to propagate, the reaction time is so short that you could potentially make the wrong step if there's a fog of war around these things. And it's something that we need to think about and keep in mind in our reaction scenarios of what is it we're going to believe and choose to respond to. Because shutting down email is a big disruption for a company.
Yeah, and I did see a lot of tail chasing. I saw a lot of senior management types in many different organizations really interrogating their IT teams about how come we weren't patched on MS 17.010, and so they were off having to go and reconcile patch records, and then you had other people trying to, like you said, figure out what does it look like when it comes in via email, and trying to add signatures and whatnot to try to stop it from getting to you as well. But in the end, those things weren't, as to the best of our knowledge, right? Those were not fruitful avenues to go down for the most part.
Right.
Um,
Now, aside from the marketing folks, everybody else I think had the best of intentions here. It's just there's a lot of conflicting information flying a lot of different directions.
yeah, I think the one thing that I saw and that I think we need to do a better job of is I saw a lot of ego, in not wanting to update your prior beliefs or your understanding of what's going on, right? So, I saw a lot of organizations kind of pick up on that email thread,
Yeah.
and it took almost, in some cases, a week for them to admit that was not real.
Interesting.
And so
Now,
in the
did you
interim,
see that? Did you see that in individuals on Twitter, or did you see that in companies' published marketing information in blogs, or you
um,
know?
so two places. One was I saw it in spades on Twitter, and then I also had a really good talk over the 4th of July with Bob. Bob actually came over for fireworks, and he caught part of my lawn on fire, but it's all good.
I
So
mean, you invite him over. This is to be expected.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, so Bob was telling me how yeah, yes, that was a really significant problem with a lot of organizations he provides services to, that
That their executives of these downstream companies had latched onto the email vector.
yeah, well, I think it was not from what he had told me. It was less the executives and more the security staff. The
Interesting.
security, and by the way, we talked about this with WannaCry, and it's kind of interesting because here you have two worms in kind of rapid succession, and we talked about at the time WannaCry was like the first real worm we had seen in a decade, and
Right.
and now here we are, a month and a half later, we have another one, and you still have this kind of myopic mindset that, well, it looks like it looks like a fish, it smells like a fish, it must be a fish, even in the face of like the Ukrainian government, breaking down the door of Intellect Software. By the way, there's a great YouTube video. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it. There's a YouTube video of the Ukrainian police. I mean, with full battle gear, automatic rifles breaking into Intellect Software to go confiscate their servers.
Well, those servers really can fight back. I mean,
Uh,
they could give you a nasty static shock. The server racks can fall over if they're not properly bolted to the ground.
you're right. You're right.
Server rooms are cold.
That's true.
They're loud.
Usually stuff stacked high that could like fall on top of your head.
I mean,
Yeah,
come
you're
on
right.
now.
You're right.
You can't underestimate what's going to happen in a data center. You really can't.
And by the way, the video from their data center was really interesting. It looked like a lunchroom that had like 4 or 5 racks with some household
Yeah.
fan.
Well, you and I have
pedestal
worked in those
fans.
places too. So
I know, but they have 400,000 customers. So anyway,
yeah, but I mean,
we
let's be
digress.
fair. They're Ukrainian customers.
Well,
I don't really know where I'm going with this. I just
yeah, I don't know either.
I think I don't mean to offend our Ukrainian listeners. I was just trying to make a joke, and I realized halfway into it, I couldn't abort.
Pull
It was
up.
a bad,
Pull up.
That's a bad joke. We'll strike that. Anyway,
Pull up. So,
so yeah. I mean, to be fair, this touches on a point I'm going to reinforce, though, that this specifically, what we know at this point, is that the bad guys knew the ME-DOC software really well because they knew where to hide this command and control callback functionality in the code. They snuck it into the code releases, the legitimate code releases from ME-DOC, and then later took over the web server that answered those update releases and redirected. And this software was one of two mandated by the Ukrainian government for tax filings. So clearly this was Ukrainian targeted.
yeah, I mean, that I think that's why everybody is so comfortable claiming that it was, a targeted operation at the Ukraine. And there's more, right? We'll get into some more details that further bolster that argument. But again, it is still a hypothesis at this point.
So jumping forward, I think we're about to talk about what it did once it got on the box.
That's exactly what we're about to talk about.
All right.
So the first thing, so now you have, let's just kind of recap, right? You've got an infected, at all of these ME.dot customers, you have an infected server or workstation running the ME.doc software, which is now trying to propagate out to other systems on the network using either Eternal Blue or credentials it captured out of memory. When it does, it basically forces a copy of NotPetya down the throat of that, those other systems, where the whole process starts over again, right? So that newly infected system now has its memory inspected and starts trying to propagate. Now, at some point later, it's not really clear to me when. At some point later, there's a schedule that I should say, the first thing that happens is the boot record is updated to include some code, which helps with the next step. So then the system reboots. Once the system reboots, the next stage of the attack happens, where the malware actually starts encrypting key parts of the drive, like the master file table.
And something I read is that it looked like it's running check disk.
Correct.
But it's not actually running check disk. It's just there to distract you.
Exactly right. It looked like the old style DOS screen where it's giving you the percent complete. But while it's doing that, it's not checking the disk. It's actually encrypting the disk.
Right.
And now, kind of where this jumped the tracks was similar to WannaCry. The message you got was that you have to pay a ransom. It was $300, which is not very much. But all of the,
maybe not very much for you, Mr. White Privilege.
Jeez.
If I'm a small Ukrainian company, that could be a lot.
In the context of business style ransomware, $300 is not a big deal. So anyway,
said from your $5 million mansion.
Yes, that's right. my diamond encrusted Lenovo laptop. I just got it back from having it, platinum plated. So anyway,
sorry, go on.
Where was it?
All right. So it runs the check disk. It does all the encryption.
Yeah, and you get the message that says you're locked out and you got to pay money to get your files back, and it gives you an email address, like a regular internet routable email address, which was quickly shut down. Right. So now you had no way to communicate with the baddies,
which is an interesting debate in of itself.
Correct, because that's not how this is done, right? I mean, that's not how ransomware business is transacted.
But let's say it was, for whatever legitimate reason. Let's say that they were just dumb.
Okay.
The authorities and whoever's shutting that down now take away the option, assuming there was one, to pay the ransom and potentially decrypt your files.
Oh, that exactly right.
And that's an interesting debate that maybe we can have at a different time of should we do that? Because some argue that there's a moral imperative to never pay the ransom. Others say that it's a personal business risk decision. And I don't know. That's something we could talk about later.
Yeah, there's no easy answer to
No.
that one, but anyway, the other important attribute of the ransomware angle is that all of the all of the infections pointed to the same Bitcoin wallet, and so without any ability to email them and without any differentiation based on who paid what and why, they're basically the allegations are there was never intended to be a mechanism by which you could, even if you wanted to, get get decryption keys. So that I think once it became widely known that was the set of facts, along with the reality this was, targeting something that was mandated by the Ukrainian government. It was not a far leap to say this is a targeted attack on the Ukraine intended to destroy data and not and destroy data and impact operations, not just it wasn't a traditional ransomware campaign.
Fair. The only thing I will say is that we don't know that for certain.
Correct. I mean, there's
And bad guys can be dumb too.
who was it that said some people just want to watch the world burn,
Right.
right?
But the level of sophistication to bury this back door and know the source code is pretty strong. Although, who knows? It could have been a disgruntled former employee. I just saying, I think we have a fetish with jumping to nation state actors right now, and
Oh, certainly do.
I try to counter that where I can.
Yeah, we definitely do, and that's
But at the same time, it could have very well could have been Russian state intelligence. They've been screwing around with Ukraine for a while now, and even annexed a big part of their territory, and are having a low-level kinetic conflict going on. So
right. And we talked about the power,
right.
the attacks in the power grid, which were also attributed to Russia too. So anyway, that being said, one of the other big confusing aspects was the name of the malware itself. Because for most of the first day, it was being referred to as Petya, which is a common, relatively common and pretty effective piece of malware. But it soon became clear that this was not actually working the same way as Petya. The way it encrypted the files was different, and the encryption algorithm was different. Apparently, Petya actually had a working mechanism for people to pay the ransom, and on and on and on. And actually, in sometime after, I think it was maybe this past week, the actual author of the real Petya came forward, basically trying to say, "Wasn't me," and in effect, gave decryption keys for being able, for decrypting Petya encrypted systems. And so, I think he wanted to make sure he stayed out of that, whole terrorist. I presume.
Not it. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I don't want a hellfire on my door. That's what I'm
Dear
saying.
Russian Spetsnaz, not it.
So anyway, yeah. So that's why it's now called not Petya, because it looked and behaved very similar to Petya, but it's not Petya. And by the way, the someone apparently has been in communication with certain members of the security community and media, and demonstrated that they actually have the keys that can successfully decrypt not Petya encrypted systems, and now are demanding a $250,000 reward. I will say, at this point in the movies, I highly doubt there are many systems left to decrypt. Because this was really bad, and I want to talk about that a bit next. The you just have to open up, Google News and search for NotPetya, right? This was devastating to a lot of really big companies that are global global names. I mean, Maersk, who runs, a lot of the world's major shipping ports, was pretty deeply affected. And I think there were quite a few multinational companies who were in the same boat. And it's interesting because this happened presumably in a organization like Maersk. It would have happened in a kind of a small corner of their network, right? Because I don't know anything about Maersk other than that I see their trucks on the road and that I know they operate a bunch of big ports. However, I suspect they don't have a huge operation in the Ukraine. But I'm guessing whatever they
But
did
if they do, they have to file taxes in Ukraine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so presumably, I would imagine most of the multinational companies that were affected by this, it kind of happened in the same way that it came in through their presence in the Ukraine and then spread because of trust and network connectivity to the mothership and beyond. So really, I mean, this has been quite bad. I was talking to Bob about some customers he's been helping, and they have had to rebuild almost everything and completely start over. There's a story on CSO, and I'll make sure the link is put up in the show notes, but it talks about how 3 hospitals in the US, like local hospitals, not huge hospital chains, but like local hospitals that were affected. And apparently one of their, this is again hypothesis, but some Twitter friends and I were kind of trying to piece together the pieces of how could a US hospital with no apparent ties to the Ukraine, no reason to run MEDoc, how could that happen? And apparently there are some medical service companies like medical transcriptionists who apparently had some Ukrainian operations that were affected. I forget the name of the one, and I probably wouldn't say it anyway. Don't want to throw them under the bus, right? But anyway,
we've already got 3 pending lawsuits. How many more do you want to defend? Seriously.
I know we can't take any more. So, yeah. One of the hospitals, by the way, chose to not rebuild. They just bought new IT. They kind of wrote off their entire IT infrastructure and have started deploying new. And by the way, Bob was telling me that is not an uncommon thing, that there are a number of these larger companies who are taking this as an opportunity. I mean, I highly doubt it's how they would want to do it, right? But they're taking this as an opportunity to move to the next version of Windows and maybe make that move to the cloud and refresh all their workstations and so on and so forth. So this is a big deal.
Yeah.
So anyhow, let's see. The next thing I wanted to talk about was how not to react if your company is like Intellect Services. So, obviously they had some problems. Like, they had IDs phished and they hadn't updated their servers in 4 years. But, quite honestly, anybody that listens to the show knows, like, that's not that uncommon, right? I mean, it happens. It's not magical and whatnot. But what is magical is that on the day that the outbreak happened, June 27th, the company Intellect Services came out and said, not us. It wasn't us. We didn't do it. We're not involved. These reports are erroneous. And I can only assume, by the way, they came to that conclusion after installing Malwarebytes.
Right. Basic version.
I don't. By the way, I really do like Malwarebytes, so it's a joke. It's an old IT joke. On June 28th, they published a statement on their website saying they were under attack, and then several hours later, they deleted it and didn't say anything more. And then on June 29th, they said, okay, maybe there is something going on. We're working with the police, and we've brought in Cisco to help us. And by the way, Cisco is one of the sources of the information, right? Because they did a bunch of forensic analysis before the police showed up on, I think, July 4th. They did a bunch of analysis and apparently got Intellect Services to agree to let them publicly talk about it, which was, kudos on them, I guess. So and then July 4th was kind of the next big milestone when the police apparently detected that there was another attack that was about to be launched or had just started to be launched through Intellect Service infrastructure. Right? There's not a lot of detail about what that attack was, or if it was the same actors, or whatever. But the police, that was what triggered the police apparently to run in with their guns blazing and seize the servers. Now, interestingly, when they seized those servers, all those 400,000 customers stopped receiving ME-DOC updates. Now, apparently, it didn't impact everybody. As I understand it, there were ME-DOC customers who hadn't yet updated to the new version, or hadn't yet applied the latest updates, which had not Petya. So anyway, not everybody apparently was wiped clean, but a lot of them were. And with the ME-DOC servers offline, apparently a lot of businesses who were still operational couldn't do their jobs because their ME-DOC apparently was one of the cores of their accounting system.
And it doesn't have an offline mode?
Well, I'm not sure if it doesn't have an offline mode or if that it was that they needed. Actually, now that you say that, I suspect what happened was because the story is a bunch of customers were kind of left out in the cold because they couldn't do their normal accounting processes because they couldn't get to the ME-DOC servers. Mm-hmm. And so companies were sharing ME-DOC binaries using Google Drive.
Huh.
And now I wonder, it just kind of stream of consciousness as we're talking here, I kind of wonder maybe it was situations where maybe there were smaller companies and they were wiped clean and they rebuilt their server and they needed to install ME-DOC to get back up and running, and they couldn't because the servers were gone.
Oh, what a mess.
So, this is there are so many different lessons here. It's kind of hard to cut into it, but well, first off, before I go further, were there other aspects of this story that you wanted to talk about?
I think you hit on most of it, or we have already. One thing that came up that from the Talos research is that they only had logs for June, and they didn't have anything for May or April or back on the Intellect Services side. So one of the lessons learned there is longer retention. Well, we'll probably get into lessons learned, but one thing I wanted to point out was that once they had the backdoor in and they had this phone home capability, and then they had the redirect going on, they could have loaded any payload. It didn't have to be ransomware, which isn't, it's interesting they chose to go down that path, but they could have done something else. They could have done small, quiet credential stealing. They could have done, you know, tax information stealing. They could have looked for intellectual property and leaked it out. There's a lot of other things they could have done.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking about that too, and it's really concerning because if you know, let's think about the way this happened, right? If you would say that to a nation state style adversary, tax information is probably not the thing you're really after. You know, it's probably more, you know, other more useful stuff, intellectual property, or you know, designs for the nuclear power plant, or you know, something along those lines. But it's unlikely, and maybe it is in the Ukraine. I don't know, right? It's probably unlikely that the ME doc system itself had a ton of information that was useful to an attacker. But when you think about it, the NotPetya attack showed that, you know, those systems had the ability, the capability of reaching out and touching a bunch of other systems.
And this was a very noisy, destructive attack. When we look at the timeline of the actual attack, it was only operational in terms of spreading, I think, for just a couple of hours.
Yes.
There's a, you know, I guess what I'm saying is that if this were truly a nation state, isn't there a lot better things to do than just burn it down? Unless that's, you know.
Depends on what your, I mean, it depends on what your end game is, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is the problem with trying to guess the motivations of attackers. It's a fool's errand, I think.
You know, if you're just trying to create chaos,
yeah,
it's not a bad way to go.
Yeah, maybe some sysadmins just wanted an extra day off, man. Maybe they're like, screw it.
That's true. I think it was, by the way, I think the attack happened the day before, was it Constitution Day in the Ukraine? I think that was the holiday. So
I have enough trouble keeping up with Canadian holidays. You want me to care about Ukrainian holidays?
You know, you are on a podcast, so maybe you should figure that out. Yep.
You know, we've been rambling along for a long time now on this thing. What's our takeaways? What's our lessons learned? How would we avoid this in the future, do you think?
So a couple of things. Good question. A couple of comments, right? I saw a lot of companies, and Bob told me this too, that kind of took the stance that because antivirus at the time was not detecting this, and there wasn't necessarily a patch available from Microsoft that would, you know, stop this, that effectively there wasn't anything that you could do. But I think.
Wait a second. Are you telling me there's not a shiny blinky box that I could buy?
Oh no! I don't know if you've paid attention to your email recently, but I have probably 100 webinar requests or invitations on how different security products would have solved this. So, you know, the takeaways for me was on the initial infection vector, mitigating that is really hard because this is like a supply chain problem.
And a vendor management questionnaire is not going to pick up this one.
Correct. Now, you know,
now,
maybe
if we take a step back and we say, okay, if you're Intellect Services, there's a whole bunch of things they could have done better in terms of using two-factor for sysadmin auth.
Absolutely.
You know, we don't know how the initial infection happened, but there's a lot of things they could have done.
If they had, you know, because again, one of the issues was that they had the attackers had changed the flow of traffic so that it, you know, routed to OVH. If they had implemented some kind of least privilege restricted firewall type connection, or at least monitored for illicit connectivity, you know, connections out of their environment, they probably would have seen that. So,
sure.
You know, I think from their perspective, multi-factor authentication, patching, you know, better firewalling.
They could have seen a huge uptick in check-ins if they had been monitoring that too.
Right.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, this attack and redirect was only going on for 3 or 4 hours.
That's correct.
I think at that point it was probably a little too late for them. I don't know that. I think if they're going to stop it, they probably need to stop it before then. Whether it's, I don't know how their code repository works. I don't know how they're authenticating those check-ins or anything like that. But maybe that's where they could have focused on.
Yeah, or the changes to the Nginx configuration file. Again, that's really close in proximity to when when the attack happened. But blocking outbound traffic that that isn't needed. That's one. I suspect this thing, the compromised infrastructure probably didn't have a need to initiate outbound connections. Because I'm going to guess that all the connections were from the MEDOC installs into their infrastructure. So that would be one. I think from a customer perspective, there's a lot of stuff that could have been done to slow or stop the propagation.
Sure. Yeah. Anything that had to do with SMB or PC exec based communication. Certainly.
PS exec.
Sorry.
Jesus Christ. Yeah. Anyway.
Look. I haven't had a drink in like a day and a half.
I get it.
It's tough. Okay.
Yep. Anyway.
But passwords of admins being reused, segmentation, AD design. Depending on how it was grabbing those passwords out of memory, there's different things you can do to harden against that attack.
Yep.
I think that there's a lot of overall cyber hygiene, for lack of a better term, that would have made this harder to spread. I think you had some thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think the things that really would have helped were number one, a much more restrictive Active Directory permission model, right? Because it's very clear to me reading this that this propagated because at every step of the way, NotPetya was able to grab credentials out of memory on that particular system that had administrative rights on some number of other systems, and that shouldn't happen, right? That if your environment is designed well, that shouldn't happen. Now I know it's less convenient, and that's probably why this happens, but that's why best practices exist, right? I mean, it's it is a trade-off, and I guess if you're going to play it fast and loose, you have to be willing to accept this sort of damage. Later versions of Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016, actually include Credential Guard, which is intended to solve this particular problem. Right? It makes it very difficult to get credentials out of memory using something like Mimikatz. So
Sure.
that's a big thing. But again, how IT organizations, especially in large established companies, don't just throw out their environment. Well, I guess maybe if you're a small hospital, you do, but it's very difficult to always be on the latest operating system. So I think that is another mitigant. Network segmentation you mentioned, I think, would have helped too. If you had the ability to compartmentalize, that would have helped.
Yeah, it wouldn't necessarily stop it, but it could have contained it.
Right, and then you would also like let's just say that MEDOC was running on a server. Does that server have any legitimate reason to talk SMB to any other system in your environment?
That's a good question.
And if it doesn't, then
Yeah.
why do you allow it?
Because it's easier, right?
And then
This is the challenge that we've had for a while now, that we still focus on a hardened perimeter, and we don't think about the fact that once somebody comes in through a side window, that they can have the run of the place. And I think we have to shift our thinking to assume, what if this host gets compromised? What if this host gets compromised? What if this host gets compromised? Because, just to answer the initial question, I still think auto-updating and auto-patching and trusting those auto-update sources is the better of the risks. And so my takeaway from this is not to trust auto-updates. This was a bit of a pocket case of a particular piece of software that the auto-updates was compromised, but I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. So then the next step is, how do I take that assumption of this could happen, or it could be something else, and better plan for breach containment
Yes.
within an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And resilience, I think, was I had two other points. One was, we covered it already a little bit, is being cognizant of the fog of war phenomenon, and recognizing, that especially when the heat is on and your environment is burning down around you, you need to make sure, and I think it's actually even more important in those kinds of cases. You need to make sure that you are periodically checking to see if the assumptions and understanding that you're working under are still accurate. Do those still represent reality? And I know that no one wants to, and I don't either, right? No one wants to go, to the CIO or CISO and say, we were doing X, but we just realized that's not fruitful, so we're going to go do Y. You don't. That's a difficult thing to do.
It is, but at the same time, we have to recognize that our attackers are constantly evolving.
Yes, exactly.
And it's really difficult. I see a lot of organizations that have very static defenses that are robust, but they're built against the risk, the threat actors and the risks and the vectors of 5 years ago. But they've exhausted their resources meeting that level of objective, and then to come and say, "Oh, we need to do something different." Everybody hears that as more work, and I'm wondering, if we've got a finite amount of resources, how do we pivot to deal with the current attack vectors and attack types without just crushing our people, whether it be in terms of lack of nimble business capabilities, getting in the way of business getting done, our IT resources and security resources being crushed by ever more requirements being loaded upon them. And so I think the organizations that think themselves the most mature in their IT security sometimes are the least nimble, because they're so invested in this monolithic security model that they've built up over years with all this compliance and audits, that when something new comes out, they have no way of dealing with it.
Right. Where's this fit on our checklist?
Right. And I'll just put it on the risk register. The bad guys look at that before they attack anyway, right?
Every time.
I'm having this struggle in my head with the duality of quote unquote really mature security organizations and being nimble to address certain threats. And those two things do not work well together right now.
I think you're right.
And unless their maturity happened to address the vector that this new attack just happened to hit, but that's coincidence. I mean, it's not that that's a bad thing. Certainly more cyber hygiene and doing some of the things we talk about. The whole point, excuse me, is making it harder for the attackers and hopefully coincidentally hitting that interrupting that kill chain. Sorry, I know you hate that word, but somewhere in that path. But if our maturity and all of our cycles being spent on addressing attack patterns of old, we're hobbling ourselves in addressing attack patterns of today and tomorrow. And so or the notorious, "Oh, I understand you want to block this new thing on Blinky Box that would stop this, but we need to go through change control, and our change control meetings happen on Thursday at 3 p.m."
Yeah, the other thing that made this a little problematic something you said just triggered this, is
Triggered.
for a lot of companies, this happened just a couple of days before quarter end, and most IT shops have a change freeze on the quarter boundaries,
Sure.
and so that was not
Most retailers
not
in
a
the
good thing.
U.S. Yeah, most retailers in the U.S. have change freeze from before Thanksgiving till after New Year's.
Correct. Yep.
Uh,
So,
so
uh, so what I will tell you, just a pragmatic piece of advice that Bob mentioned to me, which I thought was really good, is we all want to be all hands on deck when things happen, but you should carve out, especially if you have the capacity to do this. But even if you don't, I think it's important to make the time is to spend some amount of time looking at what's going on outside of your organization to see if it's still jiving with your understanding, and then pull that in. So have what Bob described was when they have these big incidents, they pull together, a kind of like a crisis team, and assign out duties. Now I know not everybody can afford a crisis team like Bob's company can, but they pick somebody, they nominate someone, and say, your job is to go, constantly read up on this, and then when we have our multiple calls per day or every day or whatever, your job is to come prepared to talk about what is the current understanding of what's happening. What are the what's being talked about in the media, and what are the security companies saying, what are the antivirus companies saying, and that you're bringing that into the discussion, and then using that to help refine the next steps. Is what we're doing still appropriate? So I think it's really important that you allocate some time, and it kind of goes along with what you just said, that if we dedicate all of our people to being reactionary and trying to go pass buckets of water to put the fire out, we're not doing that. We're not realizing that the thing we're chasing, the phishing email we're chasing, is now no longer the understood method of propagation, or I should say initial infection. Then you're missing an opportunity to focus on the real thing. So, and then the last thing I had was resilience. I wrote a little blog post about this, but the FFIC,
my
which is
God, are you self-promoting?
I know I am. The FFIC, who are banking regulators here in the U.S., that I deal with quite a lot. They've really embraced this concept of cyber resilience, and I know a lot of banks are kind of ho hum on the FFIC, but I think that they kind of are thinking about this right, that IT is different than let me say that differently. Cyber quote disasters happen differently than traditional kinetic type disasters, like pandemics or fires or floods or tornadoes or earthquakes. Those sorts of things tend to happen geographically, in a geographic area, whereas these kinds of events happen wherever your system's at. And so if you're all Windows, it doesn't necessarily matter that you have systems in all these different geographically dispersed places. They're all on the network and accessible. They're probably all going to get wiped at the same time. And so,
If there's no segmentation, right?
If there's no segmentation, that's right. And so thinking about, and again, this depends on how big and reliant on IT your company is. Because for some companies this may not be a big deal, but if it is a big deal for your company, you ought to think about, for instance, like Bob was, by the way, telling me a story of a customer of his who their Active Directory had been wiped out, but fortuitously they had shut an Active Directory server down in one of their locations for maintenance, so it was offline. And so they used that as the nucleus to
Nice.
kind of rebuild their environment. But if they hadn't had that, Bob was saying that they would have been hosed. I mean, I think they were probably hosed anyway, but
fortunate happenstance more than a plan, a
Right.
planned DR failback. But yeah,
but it points out that, as I mentioned in the blog post, these things happen on technology boundaries, not on geographic boundaries, and so
Sure.
we got to think about, how do we design a resilience program that takes that into account. So anyway, that's
yeah, I mean, it's almost like going through a DDoS exercise. If
Yes,
this circuit
absolutely.
is DOSed, what's impacted? And how can I spread out that impact? Kind of a similar mindset.
Yep, exactly
Yeah.
right. So anyway, that is that's all I had for NotPetya. Anything else you wanted to mention?
I think we've beat this one into the ground. I'm sure there's more that may come up.
Yep.
You want to do a couple of mentions and shout-outs of upcoming cons and call it a show?
Yeah, absolutely. So we will both be at DerbyCon in September, and then at the O'Reilly Security Conference over the Halloween weekend.
Hey, guess what I got for the O'Reilly Security Conference?
I heard you had a discount code.
I have a discount code.
Woohoo!
So, interest of full disclosure, we're not being paid. We are getting free admittance to the con because we're hosting the Ignite tracks.
Something or other.
Yes. So, I believe the discount code is Secure20, and we'll get you 20% off. Some of the big, Security20. Sorry, Security20 will save you 20% on the gold, silver, and bronze passes. It's a bit of a pricey show, so anything you can do helps. We are not eligible, by the way, but apparently there's a referral program that you can go to O'Reilly Security and get a unique code. And if you pimp your friends this unique code and they sign up with it, you get like $100 per person that you get signed up to 500. So
Sounds like
we should have got.
like a Ponzi scheme in the making.
I think we should have got signed up for that, if I ask me. But anyway, we'll be there.
That's right.
Hosting the Ignite tracks, which are quick 5-minute talks. Hopefully, Call for Papers or that will go out soon. And after that, we do what did we call it last year? The slideshow karaoke.
Yeah, I forget the name of it. Boy, it's hell getting old.
Yeah, I know. We basically come up with all sorts of random slides, and you have to talk to them blind. It's good fun. What else? We got asked to talk about TRCon, which we already did, and also got asked, I haven't shared this with Jerry yet, complete surprise, there is a B-Sides Bordeaux in France that Alan Liska and Tim, oh my God, I forgot his last name, who wrote the Ransomware O'Reilly book, are hosting.
Yeah. By the way, that's a really good book.
It is. I agree. I did a technical review on that book.
Well, that must be why it's so good.
I don't know. I can't say that exactly. But B-Sides Bordeaux, bsidesbdx.org. Just shout out because B-Sides is a good con to go to, and they're all over the country. Look them up.
Yep.
Go.
And apparently all over the world too.
All right, this is in France.
Yeah.
Which I'd like to, but I don't think we'll be attending. And finally, we're going to Colombia.
That's right.
Bogota,
Colombia for Tactical Edge. I think it's in March.
Yeah, in the spring,
Yep.
which is all sorts of craziness.
Absolutely. And so just for awareness, the next couple of weeks are going to be a little nutty. I'm going to be traveling here, there, and all over Europe for a couple of weeks. I'm intending to record with you from over there, so hopefully that all works out. But depends on if the internet gods are smiling at that time.
We'll give it a shot.
That's right. But anyway, thanks for listening, everyone, and we look forward to talking to you again. And with that, have a good week.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.